Tourist knocks over disabled boy at palace gates. Royal guard breaks protocol to defend him. What happens next stuns everyone. The majestic towers of Windsor Castle pierced the crisp autumn sky, their ancient stone walls standing sentinel over the bustling crowds below. But on this particular morning, the usual peace would be shattered by an incident that would touch hearts across the nation and prove that sometimes the most powerful acts of courage come from unexpected places. 10-year-old Oliver Matthews gripped the handles of his wheelchair tightly, his dark eyes wide with wonder as he gazed up at the imposing castle gates. Despite the challenges cerebral palsy had dealt him, Oliver's face radiated pure joy, dimples deepening in his cheeks as he smiled at the sight before him. His mother, Sarah, stood protectively beside him, one hand resting gently on his shoulder while she adjusted his warm scarf against the October chill. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Her other hand clutched a small backpack filled with Oliver's medications and emergency supplies, a constant reminder of their daily challenges. The morning had started with such promise. Oliver had barely slept the night before, too excited about their planned visit to Windsor Castle. He'd spent weeks learning about its history, memorizing facts about the royal guards, and practicing drawing the castle's architecture with his specially adapted art supplies. Despite the muscle control issues that made holding a pencil difficult, Oliver had filled an entire notebook with sketches, each one a testament to his determination. "Mum, look at their hats!" Oliver exclaimed, pointing excitedly at the royal guards standing at attention. His voice, though slightly slurred from his condition, carried the unmistakable enthusiasm of a child discovering something magical for the first time. "They're called bearskins, right? Did you know they're really tall because they needed to look intimidating in battle?" Sarah couldn't help but smile. These rare moments of pure happiness made every struggle worthwhile. She remembered the countless physiotherapy sessions, the late nights helping Oliver stretch his tight muscles, the times she'd had to fight with school administrators for proper accommodations. But moments like this, seeing her son's eyes shine with such genuine excitement, made it all fade away. The morning crowd was steadily growing, tourists from around the world jostling for the best photo opportunities. Among them stood Marcus Chen, a successful executive from Singapore, his expensive camera hanging around his neck and irritation etched across his face. He'd been waiting 20 minutes for the perfect shot, his perfectly pressed suit and polished shoes marking him as someone used to getting his way. The wheelchair in his frame was becoming an increasing source of frustration, ruining what he'd planned as the centerpiece of his social media travel documentation. "Excuse me," Marcus called out, his voice sharp with barely concealed annoyance. "Could you move? You're blocking the view." He gestured dismissively at Oliver and his wheelchair, as if they were merely inconvenient props in his perfect holiday photo. The gold ring on his finger caught the morning light as he waved his hand impatiently. Sarah tensed, instinctively moving closer to Oliver. She'd faced situations like this before, the sideways glances, the mumbled complaints, the subtle and not-so-subtle suggestions that they should make themselves less visible. "We have just as much right to be here as anyone else," she replied firmly, though her voice trembled slightly. "There's plenty of space to take photos from different angles." Oliver's smile faltered, his small shoulders hunching as he sensed the tension. He'd experienced this before, the stares, the whispers, the impatient sighs. Even at his young age, he understood that his wheelchair made some people uncomfortable, but his mom had always taught him to hold his head high. He gripped his sketchbook tighter, taking comfort in the familiar feel of its pages beneath his fingers. Marcus stepped closer, his expensive leather shoes clicking against the cobblestones. "Look, I've traveled halfway across the world for these photos. Surely you can appreciate that." His voice dripped with condescension as he looked down at Oliver. "Just move aside for a few minutes. It's not that difficult." The crowd around them had grown thicker, and several other tourists were now grumbling about the blocked view. Several tourists nearby shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke up. The nearest royal guard, Sergeant James Sullivan, stood rigidly at his post, but his sharp green eyes hadn't missed a moment of the exchange. In his 15 years of service, he'd maintained his composure through all sorts of tourist behavior. But something about this scene made his jaw clench beneath his stoic expression. Perhaps it was the way Oliver's eyes kept darting between his mother and the angry man, or how Sarah's hand trembled slightly as she gripped her son's wheelchair. "We're not moving," Sarah declared, her maternal instinct overriding her natural tendency to avoid confrontation. Her voice grew stronger as she continued, "Oliver has been looking forward to this visit for months. He has every right to enjoy it. His condition doesn't make him any less deserving of this experience." The air grew thick with tension as Marcus's face darkened. He muttered something under his breath about inconsiderate people and ruining everyone's experience. His expensive camera swung against his chest as he shifted his weight, his frustration building visibly. Then, in a moment that would change everything, he stepped forward abruptly, attempting to edge past Oliver's wheelchair to get his shot. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Marcus's shoulder knocked against the wheelchair, throwing it off balance. Oliver's eyes widened in fear as he felt himself tilting, his limited mobility preventing him from steadying himself. His precious sketchbook slipped from his grasp, pages of carefully drawn castles scattering across the cobblestones. Sarah reached out desperately, but she wasn't quick enough to prevent what was coming. The sound of Oliver's frightened gasp cut through the morning air like a knife, and Sergeant Sullivan's composed facade cracked. In that moment, as Oliver's wheelchair began to tip, no one could have predicted how this seemingly ordinary morning at Windsor Castle would become a story that would touch hearts across the nation and remind everyone about the true meaning of duty, compassion, and human dignity. The sound of Oliver's frightened gasp cut through the morning air like a knife, and Sergeant Sullivan's composed facade cracked. Time seemed to slow as the wheelchair tilted precariously, and what happened next would become a moment that would touch hearts across the nation. The wheelchair tipped further, Oliver's small body lurching sideways as gravity took hold. His mother's scream pierced the air, mixing with the collective gasps of the crowd. Sergeant James Sullivan's training had prepared him for many situations, but nothing quite like this. In that split second, as Oliver's wheelchair threatened to topple completely, the decorated Royal Guard made a decision that would break centuries of protocol. The heavy bearskin hat hit the cobblestones with a dull thud as Sergeant Sullivan abandoned his post. His polished boots struck the ground in 3 precise strides, covering the distance between his post and Oliver in mere seconds. With practiced precision, he caught the wheelchair just as it was about to crash onto the historic cobblestones, his strong arms steadying both the chair and its frightened occupant. The crowd fell silent, hundreds of phones now recording the unprecedented scene. Oliver's eyes were wide with shock, his small hands still gripping his armrests so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Sarah reached them a moment later, tears streaming down her face as she checked her son for injuries. "It's all right, young man," Sergeant Sullivan said softly, his voice carrying the kind of authority that commanded attention without requiring volume. "You're safe now." His green eyes, usually fixed straight ahead in the traditional 1,000-yard stare, now looked directly at Oliver with genuine concern. Marcus Chen stood frozen, his expensive camera hanging forgotten around his neck. The realization of what he'd almost caused seemed to finally register on his face, but instead of showing remorse, his expression hardened with defensive anger. "I barely touched the chair," he protested, straightening his designer suit jacket. "You can't blame me for their poor positioning." Several voices from the crowd rose in angry protest. An elderly woman with silver hair stepped forward, her phone still recording. "We all saw what happened," she declared firmly. "You deliberately pushed past them." "I did no such thing," Marcus snapped, but his voice wavered slightly as more members of the crowd began to voice their agreement with the elderly woman. Phones continued recording, capturing every moment of his increasing discomfort. Sergeant Sullivan remained by Oliver's side, one hand still steadying the wheelchair while Sarah fussed over her son. His presence seemed to grow larger, more commanding, despite having broken his formal stance. The medals on his red ceremonial uniform caught the morning light, adding weight to his authority. "Your behavior, sir," Sullivan spoke, his voice carrying the weight of his 15 years of service. is unbecoming of a guest at Her Majesty's residence. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Each word was measured, precise, but carried an undertone of steel that made Marcus take an involuntary step backward. Oliver, recovering from his initial shock, looked up at the royal guard with a mixture of awe and gratitude. "Thank you," he managed to say, his voice still shaky but clear. A small smile began to return to his face, showing remarkable resilience for someone so young. Sarah bent down, gathering Oliver's scattered sketches from the ground. Many were crumpled now, some torn from being trampled by the crowd. Tears welled in her eyes again as she saw months of her son's hard work damaged. "He spent so long on these," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. To everyone's surprise, Sergeant Sullivan knelt down, his perfectly pressed uniform touching the cobblestones as he carefully picked up one of Oliver's drawings. It was a detailed sketch of Windsor Castle, clearly done by someone who had studied its architecture with passion. Despite the obvious challenges the young artist faced with fine motor control, the love and dedication put into the work was evident. "This is quite impressive," Sullivan said, his voice softening as he handed the drawing back to Oliver. "You have quite an eye for detail, young man." The genuine admiration in his voice made Oliver's face light up with pride. Marcus, sensing the situation slipping further from his control, attempted to retreat into the crowd. "This is absurd," he muttered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "I have a schedule to keep." But Sergeant Sullivan wasn't finished. Still maintaining his dignified bearing, he turned to face Marcus fully. "Sir, you will remain where you are." The command in his voice stopped Marcus mid-step. "The Royal Security Office will need to file a report about this incident." The crowd had grown larger now, with more people gathering to witness this unprecedented scene. Whispers spread through the assembled tourists, phones continued recording, and social media was already beginning to buzz with early uploads of the incident. What had started as a simple morning at Windsor Castle was quickly becoming something much more significant. Oliver, still somewhat shaken but recovering his spirit, reached for his mother's hand. "Mum," he whispered, though loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Is the guard going to get in trouble? He left his post because of me." The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Sullivan's face remained professionally neutral, but there was no denying that he had broken one of the most fundamental rules of his position. The consequences of his actions were yet to be determined, but in that moment as he stood beside Oliver's wheelchair, not a single person in the crowd doubted he had made the right choice. As the tension at the castle gates reached its peak, a commanding figure emerged from the guard station. Captain Richard Blackwood, head of Windsor Castle's Royal Guard detail, had been observing the entire incident through the security monitors. His 30 years of service had taught him to read situations quickly, and this one demanded immediate attention. The captain's appearance caused an immediate ripple through the crowd. His pristine uniform and array of distinguished service medals spoke of decades of dedication, but it was his presence, calm, authoritative, yet somehow gentle, that commanded attention. Even Marcus Chen, who had been attempting to edge away from the scene, found himself rooted to the spot. Sergeant Sullivan straightened instinctively but didn't move from Oliver's side, his hand remaining steadily on the wheelchair. The conflict was clear on his face, the ingrained instinct to snap to attention warring with his protective stance over the young boy he'd just saved. "At ease, Sergeant," Captain Blackwood said, his voice carrying easily across the now hushed crowd. He moved with measured steps, his polished boots clicking against the cobblestones. As he approached, his eyes took in every detail. Oliver's still trembling hands, Sarah's protective stance, the scattered drawings on the ground, and Marcus's poorly concealed attempt to appear innocent. "Young man," the captain addressed Oliver directly, kneeling down to meet the boy's eye level, a gesture that made several onlookers gasp, as it was even more unprecedented than Sergeant Sullivan's actions. "Are you all right?" Oliver nodded, his eyes wide with wonder at being addressed by such an important figure. "Yes, sir," he managed, his voice small but clear. "Sergeant Sullivan caught me before I fell." Captain Blackwood's face softened almost imperceptibly. Indeed he did. His gaze shifted to Sarah, who was still clutching her son's crumpled drawings. "Madam, I understand these artworks were damaged in the incident." Before Sarah could respond, Marcus interjected, his voice taking on an oily professional tone. "Captain, if I may explain, this was clearly an accident. I'm a respected business executive and I wouldn't deliberately—" Silence. The captain's command cut through the air like a blade, though his volume hadn't raised at all. "Mr. Chen, is it? Your company's Asian-Pacific trading reputation precedes you. However," he paused, fixing Marcus with a steady gaze, "that reputation will not shield you from the consequences of your actions here." The color drained from Marcus's face. You know who I am?" "It's our duty to know everyone of note who visits the castle," Captain Blackwood replied evenly, "just as it's our duty to protect all visitors, especially those who others might see as vulnerable." His eyes flickered meaningfully to Oliver. The captain turned to address the crowd, many of whom were still recording. "Ladies and gentlemen, I must ask you to stop filming now. This incident will be handled through proper channels." To everyone's surprise, phones slowly lowered, the captain's authority extending even to the tourists who had been eagerly documenting everything. Returning his attention to Oliver, Captain Blackwood noticed the boy's sketchbook, now safely retrieved from the ground. "May I?" he asked, extending his hand. Oliver nervously handed over his precious notebook, and the captain began to carefully leaf through the pages. "Remarkable attention to detail," he commented, studying the drawings, "particularly your rendering of the Victorian architecture." He paused at one specific sketch. "This perspective of the round tower, not many people notice the subtle asymmetry in the stonework. You have quite an eye, young man." Oliver's face lit up with surprise and pride. "You can see that too? Mum said I was being too particular about the stones, but I wanted to get them right." The captain's lips curved in a slight smile. "Precision matters, especially in places of such historical significance." He carefully closed the sketchbook and handed it back to Oliver. "Which is why, Mr. Chen," he continued, his tone hardening as he turned to face Marcus, "your behavior today is particularly disappointing." Marcus shifted uncomfortably, his earlier arrogance completely deflated. I apologize," he stammered, but the captain held up a hand. "Your apology, while necessary, is insufficient." Captain Blackwood's voice carried the weight of centuries of tradition. "Sergeant Sullivan broke protocol today, yes, but he did so in service of our highest duty, protecting those in our care. Your actions, in contrast, violated the most basic principles of human dignity." Sarah, who had been watching this exchange in stunned silence, finally spoke up. "We don't want to cause any trouble, Captain. We're just grateful that Sergeant Sullivan was there to help." "No trouble at all, madam," the captain replied, his tone gentler. "In fact—" He paused, seeming to consider something carefully. "Oliver, would you and your mother be interested in a private tour of the castle's architectural highlights? Some areas not usually open to the public? I believe we might have some historical drawings that would interest an aspiring artist such as yourself." Oliver's eyes grew impossibly wide, and for a moment his disability seemed to fade away in the pure joy of the moment. "Really? Mum, can we?" The captain raised an eyebrow at Marcus, who was still hovering uncertainly nearby. "Mr. Chen, I believe you mentioned having a schedule to keep. The security office will be in touch regarding the incident. You may go." The dismissal was clear, and Marcus, for once speechless, turned and hurried away through the crowd, which parted silently to let him pass. As Marcus Chen's figure disappeared into the crowd, Captain Blackwood turned his attention back to more pressing matters. "Sergeant Sullivan," he called, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "A word, if you please." The two men stepped slightly aside, though Sullivan's eyes kept darting back to Oliver, as if still concerned for the boy's safety. Sarah watched the exchange anxiously, her hands nervously straightening Oliver's rumpled jacket. The crowd had begun to disperse, though small groups lingered, whispering among themselves about what they'd witnessed. Already, social media was buzzing with partial clips of the incident, despite the captain's request to stop filming. "But what about his post?" Oliver whispered to his mother, genuine concern in his voice as he watched Sergeant Sullivan speaking with his superior officer. "He left it because of me." The guilt in the young boy's voice was palpable, his earlier excitement about the private tour temporarily forgotten in his worry for the guard who had helped him. Before Sarah could respond, a new figure approached, a woman in her mid-60s with carefully styled silver hair and an air of quiet authority. "Excuse me," she said, her cultured accent marking her as someone of significance. "I'm Lady Margaret Worthington, Castle Curator." She smiled warmly at Oliver. "I couldn't help but overhear about your interest in architecture." Oliver clutched his sketchbook tighter, suddenly shy in the presence of yet another important figure. "Yes, ma'am," he managed, his voice small but clear. "I love drawing buildings, especially old ones with stories." Lady Margaret's eyes sparkled with interest. "Well, this castle certainly has its share of stories." She glanced at the scattered pages Sarah was still trying to gather. "May I?" she asked, gesturing to the sketchbook. Oliver hesitantly handed it over, and Lady Margaret began to examine his drawings with genuine interest. Meanwhile, the conversation between Captain Blackwood and Sergeant Sullivan had taken an unexpected turn. "Your actions today," the captain was saying, his voice carrying just far enough for those nearby to hear, "were technically in violation of standing orders." Sullivan stood at attention, his face composed but his jaw tight. "Yes, sir. I accept full responsibility." "As you should," Blackwood continued, but there was something in his tone that made everyone listen more carefully. "However, the primary duty of the Royal Guard has always been to protect those in our charge. Sometimes, Sergeant, that duty requires us to make split-second decisions that don't align with standard protocol." A small crowd of castle staff had begun to gather, drawn by the unusual events. Among them was Thomas Wright, the elderly head groundskeeper who had served at Windsor Castle for over 4 decades. He watched the scene unfold with knowing eyes, having seen countless incidents over his years of service. "The boy's drawings," Lady Margaret called out suddenly, her voice carrying a note of excitement. "Captain, you must see these. His perspective on the Norman Gate is remarkable." She held up one of Oliver's sketches, and several staff members moved closer to look. Thomas Wright adjusted his glasses and peered at the drawing. "Well, I'll be," he muttered. "The lads caught the shadow play from the western angle. Most visitors don't even notice that detail." His weathered face broke into a warm smile as he looked at Oliver. "How long have you been studying our castle, young man?" Oliver's face flushed with pride. 3 months, sir. I've been reading everything I could find about it. Did you know the Round Tower was originally built by Henry II in the 12th century? His voice grew stronger as he spoke about his passion, his earlier trauma temporarily forgotten in his excitement to share his knowledge. Sarah watched in amazement as her son engaged with the castle staff, his usual self-consciousness about his disability fading as he discussed architecture and history. This was the Oliver she always knew was there, bright, engaging, and full of enthusiasm. Captain Blackwood cleared his throat, drawing attention back to the matter at hand. "Sergeant Sullivan, your action today will be noted in the official record." He paused, allowing the tension to build, "as will the commendation that accompanies it." A collective murmur of approval rippled through the gathered staff. Sullivan's shoulders relaxed slightly, though he maintained his professional bearing. "Thank you, sir, but I only did what was necessary." "Precisely," Blackwood replied, a hint of approval in his voice. "And that's exactly what we expect from our guards, the wisdom to know when necessity outweighs protocol." Lady Margaret stepped forward, still holding Oliver's sketchbook. "Captain, if I may suggest something?" At his nod, she continued, "Given young Oliver's obvious talent and interest in the castle's architecture, perhaps we could arrange something more educational?" The captain's eyebrow raised slightly. "What did you have in mind?" "Well," Lady Margaret smiled, "we do have that upcoming exhibition on Windsor Castle's architectural evolution. We could use a fresh perspective in the planning stages." She turned to Oliver. Would you be interested in helping us ensure the exhibition is accessible to visitors with different needs? Your insight would be invaluable." Oliver's eyes widened in disbelief. "Me? But I'm just a kid," he stammered, his hand unconsciously gripping his wheelchair's armrest. "A kid with an exceptional eye for detail and a unique perspective we could very much use," Lady Margaret replied firmly. She looked at Sarah. "With your permission, of course." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of joy. Yes, of course. If Oliver wants to." Thomas Wright chuckled softly. "In all my years here, I've never seen someone capture the soul of this place quite like your boy has in these drawings. It would be our honor to have his input." Sergeant Sullivan, still standing at attention, allowed himself a small smile. "Permission to return to my post, sir?" he asked Captain Blackwood. The captain nodded, but then added, "After you've helped escort Oliver and his mother to the curator's office, we have some details to arrange." His tone made it clear this was both a reward and a recognition of Sullivan's actions. As Oliver and his mother followed Lady Margaret toward the curator's office, Sergeant Sullivan fell into step beside them, his practiced stride adjusting naturally to the wheelchair's pace. The castle corridors seemed to come alive with history as they walked, their footsteps echoing off ancient stones that had witnessed centuries of stories. "You know," Sullivan said quietly, breaking his usual stoic demeanor, "I had a brother with cerebral palsy." The words hung in the air for a moment, heavy with meaning. Oliver's hands stilled on his wheelchair's wheels as he looked up at the guard with newfound understanding. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "Had?" she asked softly, sensing there was more to this revelation. Sullivan nodded, his eyes fixed ahead as they walked. "James. He passed away 5 years ago." His voice remained steady, but there was an undercurrent of emotion that made Oliver reach out instinctively, placing his small hand on the guard's uniform sleeve. "He loved this castle too," Sullivan continued, managing a small smile. "Used to make me describe every detail when I first started my posting here. Said he could see it better through my eyes than in any photograph." Lady Margaret, who had been walking slightly ahead, slowed her pace to listen. Even Captain Blackwood, following behind them, seemed to lean forward with interest. "James never got to visit in person," Sullivan explained, his professional facade softening as he shared his story. His condition was more severe, and travel was difficult. But he could tell you every fact about Windsor Castle's history, every architectural detail, every royal ceremony that ever took place here. He paused, looking down at Oliver's sketchbook. "He would have loved your drawings." Oliver clutched his sketchbook tighter, a mix of emotions crossing his face. "Did he try to draw too?" "He did." Sullivan smiled, the memory clearly fond. Though he preferred writing, kept detailed journals about everything he learned. Said that just because his body had limits didn't mean his mind had to. They reached the curator's office, a warm, wood-paneled room filled with maps, architectural drawings, and historical documents. Lady Margaret gestured for them to enter, but paused when she noticed Oliver staring at a large architectural rendering of the castle on the wall. "That's from 1875, she explained, watching the boy's eyes trace the intricate details. "The artist spent months getting every detail perfect." She turned to Sarah, her voice taking on a more serious tone. "Mrs. Matthews, there's something else we'd like to discuss with you." Captain Blackwood stepped forward, his presence filling the room. "We've been planning to launch an initiative for making the castle more accessible to visitors with disabilities. It's something that's been in discussion for months, but we've lacked a certain perspective." Sarah's eyes widened with understanding. "And you think Oliver could help?" "Not just help," Lady Margaret interjected, her eyes sparkling with enthusiasm. "We'd like him to be a key consultant. His unique viewpoint as both an architecture enthusiast and someone who navigates spaces differently could be invaluable." Oliver's mouth fell open in surprise. But I'm just someone who sees this castle in a way many of us never could," Sullivan finished for him, his voice firm but kind. "Just like James did." Captain Blackwood cleared his throat. "The position would come with some compensation, of course. and full access to the castle's architectural archives for your research and drawings. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. It's too much. After everything that happened today. Sometimes, Lady Margaret said gently, the most difficult moments lead us exactly where we need to be. She reached into a drawer and pulled out a leather-bound journal. Sergeant Sullivan, I believe this belongs to you. Sullivan's eyes widened in recognition. James's journal. I donated it to the castle archives last year. Indeed, Lady Margaret smiled. Your brother's detailed observations about accessibility challenges have already been instrumental in our initial planning. It seems fitting that another young man with similar passion should help carry that work forward. Oliver wheeled closer to Sullivan, his eyes bright with interest. Could I read what your brother wrote? The guard knelt down to Oliver's level, emotion briefly breaking through his professional composure. I think James would have wanted that very much. Captain Blackwood watched this exchange with approval. Well then, it seems we have much to discuss. He gestured to the comfortable chairs arranged around a large oak table. Shall we begin planning how to make Windsor Castle a place where everyone can fully appreciate its majesty? As they settled in for their discussion, Sarah noticed something remarkable. The tension that usually resided in Oliver's shoulders when meeting new people had completely disappeared. Here, surrounded by people who saw his potential rather than his limitations, her son was transformed. His disability wasn't something to be overlooked or pitied. It was part of what made his perspective valuable. Sullivan remained standing near the door, ever the professional guard, but his eyes kept returning to Oliver as the boy eagerly shared his ideas with Lady Margaret. In the young artist's enthusiasm, he saw echoes of his brother's spirit, and for the first time in years, the weight of that loss felt a little lighter. The autumn sun streamed through the office's ancient windows, casting long shadows across centuries-old stone floors. In this moment, past and present seemed to merge. A boy with dreams as big as the castle itself, a guard whose protection went far beyond his official duties, and a future where Windsor Castle's grandeur would truly be accessible to all. Later that afternoon, as the autumn sun began its descent behind Windsor Castle's ancient towers, Oliver sat in the castle's private garden, his wheelchair positioned perfectly to capture the play of light on the weathered stones. His sketchbook lay open on his lap, but for once he wasn't drawing. Instead, his mind wandered through the whirlwind of events that had transformed what should have been a simple castle visit into something far more significant. Sarah sat on a nearby bench, watching her son with a mixture of pride and concern. The castle staff had provided them with a quiet moment to process everything that had happened, but she could see the emotional weight of the day settling on Oliver's young shoulders. Her phone had been buzzing constantly with notifications. The incident had gone viral, with number Windsor Guardian trending across social media platforms. Mum, Oliver finally spoke, his voice thoughtful. Do you think Mr. Chen will get in trouble? The question surprised Sarah. It was so characteristic of her son to worry about others, even those who had wronged him. Before she could answer, a familiar figure appeared at the garden entrance. Sergeant Sullivan, now off his formal duty shift but still in uniform, approached with measured steps. May I join you? He asked, his formal demeanor softened by genuine warmth. Oliver nodded eagerly, and Sullivan settled onto the bench near Sarah. He carried something under his arm, a worn leather case that had seen years of use. I thought you might like to see something, he said, carefully opening the case to reveal a collection of old photographs and papers. These were James's, he explained, selecting a photograph and holding it out to Oliver. The image showed a young man in a wheelchair, his face bright with laughter despite the obvious signs of cerebral palsy. This was taken the day he graduated university with his degree in architectural history. Oliver studied the photo intently, his fingers tracing the edges with careful reverence. He looks happy, he observed quietly. He was. Sullivan nodded, his professional guard's voice giving way to a softer tone. James never let his condition define what he could achieve, but... He paused, choosing his words carefully. He also wasn't afraid to let it shape his perspective. That's what made his insight so valuable. Sarah watched as her son absorbed these words, seeing something shift in his expression. Oliver has always tried to hide his condition, she shared, her voice thick with emotion. He works so hard to blend in, to not be the boy in the wheelchair. Sullivan leaned forward, his eyes meeting Oliver's directly. Do you know what James used to say about that? When Oliver shook his head, Sullivan continued. He said that trying to blend in means the world misses out on your unique view of it. Your drawings, Oliver, they show details that most people miss because you see this castle from a different angle. That's not a weakness. It's a gift. The garden fell silent except for the distant chatter of tourists beyond the walls. Oliver's hands moved to his sketchbook, fingers running over the pages of his castle drawings. But people stare, he said finally, voicing a fear he'd carried for years. They treat me differently. They do, Sullivan agreed, surprising both Oliver and Sarah with his honesty. And sometimes, like today, they act cruelly because of their own limitations, their rush to judge, their failure to see beyond the surface. But look what happened today. Your perspective, your passion for this castle, it's going to help make it better for countless others. Sarah wiped away tears as she watched her son process these words. The garden's flowers swayed gently in the afternoon breeze, their colors painting a peaceful backdrop to this moment of transformation. Sergeant, Oliver began hesitantly, did James ever get angry? About everything? Sullivan's face softened with understanding. Often, he admitted. He had days where the frustration felt overwhelming, but he channeled that energy into his writing, into advocating for change. He used to say that anger was just passion that hadn't found its proper direction yet. A castle staff member appeared at the garden entrance, signaling that Lady Margaret was ready to continue their meeting about the accessibility initiative. But Sullivan held up a hand, asking for a moment more. Oliver, he said, reaching into the leather case one last time, I want you to have something. He withdrew a small leather-bound notebook. These are James's original notes about making historic buildings more accessible. He never got to see his ideas implemented, but through you. He placed the notebook in Oliver's hands. Through you, they might finally become reality. Oliver's fingers trembled as he accepted the notebook, understanding the weight of what he was being given. Not just papers and ideas, but a legacy to carry forward. I'll make him proud, he whispered, clutching the notebook to his chest. Sullivan stood, straightening his uniform out of habit. You already have, he said simply. Now shall we go see about making this castle a place where everyone can find their own unique view? As they made their way back into the castle, Oliver wheeled his chair with renewed confidence. The morning's incident with Marcus Chen, which had started with hurt and humiliation, had somehow transformed into something powerful. A reminder that sometimes the very things that make us different are the things that make us most valuable. Sarah walked beside her son, noticing how he held himself differently now. The wheelchair no longer seemed like something he was trying to hide, but rather a part of who he was. A perspective, a vantage point, a way of seeing the world that was uniquely his own. The next morning dawned crisp and clear over Windsor Castle, its ancient stones glowing golden in the early light. In a small hotel room nearby, Oliver sat by the window, James's journal open on the desk before him. He'd barely slept, too engrossed in reading the detailed observations and thoughtful insights penned by Sergeant Sullivan's brother years ago. Sarah found him there, already dressed and ready for their return to the castle. You're up early, she said softly, noticing the intense concentration on her son's face. The events of yesterday had left their mark, but not in the way she might have expected. Mom, listen to this, Oliver said excitedly, his fingers carefully tracing the handwritten words. The true measure of a building's grandeur isn't in its height or its age, but in its ability to welcome all who seek its shelter. James wrote that about Windsor Castle. His voice carried a newfound confidence, the slight slur in his speech now seeming less like something to hide and more like simply part of who he was. The television in their room was playing the morning news, and suddenly both mother and son fell silent as their story appeared on screen. The footage showed the incident with Marcus Chen, then Sergeant Sullivan's intervention, but it was the commentary that followed that caught their attention. In an unprecedented moment at Windsor Castle, the reporter was saying, a Royal Guard's actions have sparked a national conversation about accessibility and inclusion at historic sites. The incident has led to the announcement of a new initiative to make Windsor Castle more accessible to visitors with disabilities, with input from the very young man at the center of yesterday's events. The screen showed clips from an official palace statement, followed by social media reactions. The hashtag #Windsor Guardian had evolved into #Accessible Windsor, with people sharing their own stories of struggling to visit historic sites with disabilities. Oliver, Sarah said carefully, watching her son's reaction. How are you feeling about all of this? She knew how much he usually hated drawing attention to his condition. Oliver was quiet for a moment, his hands resting on the journal's worn pages. I used to think, he started slowly, that being in this chair meant I had to try harder to be normal. But James, he tapped the journal. He saw things differently. He said that sometimes the best view of a castle isn't from standing up straight, but from sitting down and really looking. A knock at their door interrupted the moment. It was Thomas Wright, the head groundskeeper they'd met yesterday, holding a large manila envelope. Good morning, he said warmly. Lady Margaret asked me to deliver these before your meeting today. Inside the envelope were architectural drawings of the castle, official blueprints and planning documents. But what caught Oliver's eye was a note attached to the front. For our new accessibility consultant, your perspective is invaluable. Lady Margaret. As Oliver pored over the drawings, Thomas shared something unexpected. You know, young man, your situation yesterday has already made a difference. This morning we had a family visit with their daughter. She's in a wheelchair too. They said they'd been hesitant to come, but after seeing the news about you... Sarah's eyes welled with tears as she watched her son's face light up at this news. The incident that could have been traumatic had somehow transformed into something powerful. Oliver's phone buzzed, a message from the castle's official account confirming their meeting time. But there was something else, a social media notification. Someone had created an online gallery of his castle sketches, shared with permission from Lady Margaret. Paired with James's written observations about accessibility, the comments section was filled with messages of support and stories from others who had faced similar challenges. Mum, Oliver said suddenly, I want to change clothes. He wheeled over to his suitcase, pulling out the smart new outfit they'd bought for special occasions, but he'd always been too self-conscious to wear. If I'm going to be a consultant, I should dress like one. Sarah helped him change, noting how he sat straighter in his chair, no longer trying to make himself smaller or less noticeable. As she adjusted his collar, she caught their reflection in the mirror. Her son, looking professional and confident, his disability neither hidden nor flaunted, simply part of who he was. They arrived at the castle early, finding Sergeant Sullivan already waiting at the gates. He was back at his post, standing at attention, but his eyes crinkled slightly at the corners when he saw them approach, a subtle acknowledgement that didn't break protocol. As they waited to be escorted to their meeting, Oliver pulled out his sketchbook and began a new drawing. This time, though, his perspective was different. Instead of trying to capture the castle as others might see it, he drew it from his eye level, showing details and angles that only someone in a wheelchair might notice. What are you working on? Sarah asked, watching his careful strokes. It's for the accessibility project, Oliver explained, his voice steady with purpose. James wrote about how the castle looks different from sitting down. I want to show everyone exactly what he meant. A small crowd of tourists had gathered nearby, some recognizing them from the news. But for the first time in his life, Oliver didn't feel the need to hide from their glances. Instead, he continued his drawing, occasionally looking up at Sergeant Sullivan's stoic figure, remembering the guard's words from yesterday about perspective being a gift rather than a limitation. The autumn breeze carried the sound of the changing guard ceremony in the distance, a centuries-old tradition continuing as it always had. But here, in this moment, something new was beginning. a young boy's journey from trying to blend in to standing out in all the right ways. His wheelchair no longer a barrier but a unique vantage point from which to view the world. The story of Oliver, the Royal Guard, and Windsor Castle had taken on a life of its own. A week after the incident, the castle's visitor center was hosting its first accessibility consultation meeting, and the room was packed with unexpected attendees from across the country. Among them sat Marcus Chen, his usual pristine suit slightly rumpled, his previous arrogance replaced by an unfamiliar humility. The viral video of his actions had reached his company's board of directors, leading to a very uncomfortable conversation about corporate social responsibility and public image. But something else had happened too. His own daughter had seen the video and asked him a simple question that shattered his world. "Daddy, why were you so mean to that boy?" The meeting room buzzed with activity. Disability rights advocates sat alongside historical preservation experts, all gathered around a large table where Oliver's drawings were spread out. Lady Margaret stood at the front, but rather than leading the discussion herself, she had given that honor to Oliver, who sat straight in his wheelchair, James's journal open beside his own notes. "The thing about historic buildings," Oliver was explaining, his voice clear despite his nervousness, "is that they weren't built with everyone in mind, but that doesn't mean they can't be adapted." He gestured to one of his drawings, which showed a clever solution for integrating a wheelchair lift into the castle's ancient stonework without compromising its historical integrity. Sergeant Sullivan, off-duty and in civilian clothes, sat quietly in the back of the room. His presence had become a symbol of something larger than just one guard's quick action. He represented the human element of accessibility, the understanding that sometimes rules needed to bend to accommodate compassion. A woman raised her hand. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, no relation to Marcus, a renowned architect specializing in historical buildings. "Oliver," she said, leaning forward with interest, "these solutions you're proposing, they're remarkably innovative. How did you come up with them?" Oliver glanced at James's journal before answering. "Well, when you spend your life looking at buildings from this angle," he patted his wheelchair, "you start to see possibilities others might miss." And then I read James's notes. He looked at Sullivan, who nodded encouragingly. He had all these ideas that just needed someone to bring them to life. The meeting continued, but the real story was happening in the subtle interactions around the room. A castle staff member who had initially expressed concerns about modern modifications was now nodding thoughtfully at Oliver's suggestions. A group of architectural students were frantically taking notes, their previous assumptions about accessibility in historic buildings being thoroughly challenged. Sarah watched from her seat near the window, remembering how just a week ago her son had tried to make himself invisible during their castle visit. Now he was commanding attention not despite his disability, but because of the unique perspective it gave him. During a break in the meeting, Marcus Chen approached Oliver's table hesitantly. The room quieted, tension filling the air as people remembered his role in starting all of this. But Oliver, showing wisdom beyond his years, simply looked up at him expectantly. I brought something for you," Marcus said, placing a package on the table. Inside was a professional-grade drawing tablet, the kind artists used for digital work. "My daughter, she's learning to draw too. She thought this might help when your hands get tired from holding pencils." Oliver's eyes widened at the gift, but it was his response that caught everyone off guard. "Thank you, Mr. Chen. Would your daughter like to see my drawings of the castle? The real ones, I mean, not just the ones she saw online?" The simple gesture of inclusion brought unexpected tears to Marcus's eyes. "She would love that," he managed to say. She'd like to come visit the castle someday." "Well," Oliver smiled, gesturing to his accessibility plans, "we're working on making sure everyone can visit properly. Lady Margaret chose this moment to make an announcement that would change everything. The board has approved our initial proposals," she declared, holding up an official-looking document. "Windsor Castle will be the first royal residence to implement a comprehensive accessibility program, with Oliver serving as our lead youth consultant." The room erupted in applause, but it was the next piece of news that truly captured everyone's attention. Furthermore, she continued, we've received inquiries from other historic sites across the country. They want to know if our young consultant would be willing to share his expertise. Oliver's face flushed with pride, but he quickly looked to Sullivan. Would James have wanted that? For his ideas to go beyond Windsor? Sullivan moved from his spot at the back of the room to stand beside Oliver's wheelchair. James always said that true accessibility wasn't just about ramps and lifts. It was about changing how people think about space and inclusion. I'd say you're doing exactly what he dreamed of. The meeting evolved into something more than just a consultation about Windsor Castle. It became a moment of transformation, where the incident that had gone viral was now catalyzing real change. Phones around the room captured new footage, not of conflict this time, but of collaboration, of barriers being broken down in more ways than one. As the day drew to a close, Oliver found himself back in the castle courtyard, looking up at the ancient walls with new eyes. Sergeant Sullivan had resumed his post, standing at attention, but now there was something different about his stance. A subtle pride that showed through even his strict military bearing. "Mom," Oliver said, taking out his sketchbook one more time. "I think I finally know how to draw the castle properly." "How's that?" Sarah asked, watching as her son's hands moved confidently across the paper. "Just as it is," he replied, "but with all the new possibilities we can see now." The setting sun cast long shadows across the courtyard, but for once those shadows didn't seem like barriers. Instead, they were just another way of seeing things differently, something Oliver was teaching everyone to appreciate. 2 weeks after the initial incident, Oliver sat in Captain Blackwood's office facing a moment that would define not just his future, but potentially the future of historic preservation and accessibility across Britain. The morning papers lay spread across the captain's desk, their headlines telling a story none of them had anticipated. Young consultant revolutionizes castle access, Windsor leads the way in historic site inclusion, and most notably, royal family endorses accessibility initiative. It's quite something, Captain Blackwood mused, watching Oliver study the headlines. But with all this attention comes a serious decision. He slid a formal document across his desk. The Historic Royal Palaces Commission wants to expand this program beyond Windsor. They're asking for your involvement in a nationwide initiative. Sarah, seated beside Oliver, reached for her son's hand. This was bigger than anything they'd imagined when they'd first visited the castle that fateful day. "Oliver, you don't have to decide right now," she said softly. But Oliver wasn't looking at his mother or even at Captain Blackwood. His eyes were fixed on Sergeant Sullivan, who stood by the window in his off-duty clothes, James's journal clutched in his hands. "What would James have done?" Oliver asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sullivan moved to kneel beside Oliver's wheelchair, opening the journal to a dog-eared page. "James wrote something here that I think answers that question," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "The greatest barriers aren't the physical ones, they're the ones in people's minds. Change one person's perspective and you might change 100 more." Lady Margaret, who had been quietly observing from a corner of the office, stepped forward. "Oliver, before you make your decision, there's something else you should see." She gestured to Thomas Wright, who wheeled in a covered easel. With a flourish, he removed the cloth to reveal one of Oliver's drawings, but not in its original form. The sketch had been professionally rendered into an architectural proposal, Oliver's unique perspective preserved but enhanced with technical details. It showed Windsor Castle as it could be, historic and grand, yet welcoming to all. But more striking were the notes in the margins, comments from architects, historians, and accessibility experts all praising the innovative approach. "Your drawing has already inspired similar proposals for other historic sites," Lady Margaret explained. "The Tower of London, Edinburgh Castle, even some private historic homes are asking about your design principles." Oliver wheeled closer to examine the rendering, his hands hovering over the careful details. "But I'm only 10. How can I help with all those places?" Marcus Chen, who had been invited to the meeting as part of his own journey of redemption, spoke up from his seat near the door. Age doesn't determine impact, he said quietly. My daughter reminded me of that. She's 8, and she changed my entire worldview with a single question. Captain Blackwood leaned forward, his military bearing softening slightly. Oliver, no one expects you to do this alone. We're proposing a team, architects, historians, accessibility experts, with you as our guiding voice. Your perspective, combined with James's research, could transform how we preserve history while making it accessible to everyone. The room fell silent as Oliver processed this information. Sarah watched her son's face, seeing him work through the enormity of the decision before him. The past 2 weeks had changed him profoundly. Gone was the boy who tried to hide his disability, replaced by someone who understood its value. There's something else, Sullivan said, pulling another item from James's journal. A photograph Oliver hadn't seen before. It showed James at a protest rally holding a sign that read, "History belongs to everyone." Despite being confined to his wheelchair, his face shone with determination. The day before he passed away, Sullivan continued, James made me promise that I would never stop fighting for accessibility. I didn't know how to fulfill that promise until I met you, Oliver. Oliver's hands gripped his wheelchair's armrests, his decision crystallizing. I want to do it, he said firmly, but I have conditions. Captain Blackwood raised an eyebrow, a slight smile playing at his lips. Go on. First, Oliver began, sitting straighter. I want to make sure other kids with disabilities are involved too. Their perspectives matter just as much as mine. He glanced at Marcus. Like your daughter. She should be part of this if she wants to be. Marcus nodded, emotion evident on his face. Second, Oliver continued, I want James's name on everything we do. His ideas deserve to be remembered. Sullivan's hand gripped the journal tighter, his eyes glistening. And third, Oliver looked directly at Captain Blackwood, I want Sergeant Sullivan involved in all of it, not just as a guard, but as someone who understands both sides, the importance of preserving tradition and the need for change. Lady Margaret stepped forward, her face beaming. I think those conditions perfectly encapsulate what this whole initiative stands for. Connection, remembrance, and balance. Captain Blackwood stood, bringing an official air to the moment. Then, Mr. Matthews, shall we make it official? He held out his hand to Oliver, treating him not as a child, but as a colleague. Oliver reached out to shake the captain's hand, his grip firm despite his condition. In that moment, the office seemed to hold its breath, witnesses to a turning point not just in Oliver's life, but in the way Britain's historical treasures would be preserved and shared for generations to come. The autumn sun streamed through the office windows, casting long shadows across the floor. But now these shadows seemed to point forward, toward a future where history's doors would truly be open to everyone. Oliver glanced at his mother, seeing happy tears in her eyes, then at Sullivan, who stood proud and tall, his brother's journal held like a precious treasure against his chest. The decision was made. The real work was about to begin. 1 month after the fateful incident at Windsor Castle, Oliver found himself back at the gates, but this time everything was different. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones as he wheeled confidently past the spot where his life had changed so dramatically. Sergeant Sullivan stood at his post, as straight and disciplined as ever, but there was a subtle nod of recognition as Oliver passed. Today marked the first official meeting of the Historic Sites Accessibility Council, and Oliver was no longer just a consultant. He was its youngest ever committee member. The weight of the responsibility settled on his shoulders as he entered the castle's newly modified conference room, designed specifically to accommodate wheelchairs and other mobility aids. There's our rising star, Lady Margaret greeted him warmly, helping Sarah arrange Oliver's materials on the conference table. The room was filling with an impressive array of professionals, architects, historians, disability rights advocates, and representatives from various historic sites across Britain. Among them sat Marcus Chen, now serving as the corporate liaison for accessibility funding. But it was the unexpected presence of someone else that caught Oliver's attention. A distinguished-looking woman in a wheelchair, her silver hair elegantly styled, her posture regal. "Oliver," Lady Margaret said with a smile, "I'd like you to meet Dr. Helen Sullivan." Oliver's eyes widened in recognition. "Sullivan? Are you—" "James's mother," she confirmed, wheeling closer to shake his hand. "And Sergeant Sullivan's mother too, of course." Her eyes sparkled with warmth. "When I heard about what you're doing here, I knew I had to come. James would have loved this." Before Oliver could respond, Captain Blackwood called the meeting to order. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we're here today to begin something unprecedented. Thanks to Oliver Matthews and the legacy of James Sullivan, we're about to reimagine how Britain preserves and shares its historical heritage." Dr. Sullivan reached into her bag and pulled out a thick folder. "These are James's university research papers on historic building accessibility. He never got to implement them, but he always believed someone would carry his work forward someday." She placed the folder in front of Oliver. "I think he would have chosen you." The meeting proceeded with presentations and discussions, but it was Oliver's contribution that captured everyone's attention. Using his new drawing tablet, Marcus's gift, he demonstrated how digital technology could help visualize accessibility solutions before implementation. "The key," Oliver explained, his voice steady despite addressing such an important audience, "is to remember that accessibility isn't just about physical changes. It's about changing how we think about spaces." He pulled up one of his drawings on the large screen. "See how the castle looks different from various heights and angles? That's what James understood. Every perspective adds to the story of a place." Dr. Sullivan wiped away tears as Oliver referenced her son's work, while Sergeant Sullivan, who had been given special permission to attend during his break, stood proudly at the back of the room. The family connection added a deeper dimension to the project, turning clinical accessibility requirements into something more personal and meaningful. As the meeting progressed, Oliver found himself surrounded by a growing network of mentors. Dr. Sullivan shared stories about James's research methods, Lady Margaret offered insights into historical preservation, and even Marcus Chen contributed valuable perspectives about corporate social responsibility and funding. During a break, Dr. Sullivan wheeled closer to Oliver. "You know," she said softly, "James always said that his wheelchair gave him a superpower, the ability to see things others missed. I see that same gift in you, young man." Oliver glanced down at his own wheelchair thoughtfully. "I used to hate it," he admitted. "I thought it made me less than everyone else." "And now?" she prompted gently. "Now I understand what James meant. It's not about being less or more. It's about seeing things differently. And sometimes different is exactly what's needed." The afternoon session brought a surprise visitor, a representative from the royal family, expressing their interest in extending the accessibility initiative to all royal properties. The announcement sent a buzz through the room, but Oliver's attention was drawn to Sergeant Sullivan's face, seeing the pride and emotion there. During the final presentations, Oliver unveiled his most ambitious proposal yet, a digital platform that would allow virtual tours of historic sites from multiple perspectives, including wheelchair height. "This way," he explained, "people who can't physically visit can still experience these places, and those who can visit will understand different perspectives better." Dr. Sullivan reached over and squeezed his hand. "James would have loved that idea," she whispered. "He always said that understanding comes from seeing through other people's eyes." As the meeting concluded, Captain Blackwood made one final announcement. "Thanks to Oliver's influence and the generous support of our corporate partners," he nodded to Marcus, "Windsor Castle will be hosting monthly accessibility workshops for other historic sites. And," he paused for effect, "we're establishing the James Sullivan Memorial Scholarship for young people interested in accessible architecture." The room erupted in applause, but Oliver's attention was on the Sullivan family, the guard who had changed his life, the mother who had raised two remarkable sons, and the memory of James, whose ideas were finally coming to life in ways he might never have imagined. As people began to leave, Dr. Sullivan handed Oliver one last item, a small, worn notebook. This was James's first journal, she said softly. He started it when he was about your age. I think he'd want you to have it. Oliver held the notebook carefully, feeling the weight of its legacy. He looked around the room, at Sarah beaming with pride, at Marcus Chen discussing funding with other corporate representatives, at Lady Margaret reviewing architectural plans, and at Sergeant Sullivan, standing tall and proud in his uniform. This was more than just a committee or an initiative. It was becoming a family of sorts, united by a shared vision of making history accessible to everyone. And at its heart was a 10-year-old boy who had learned that sometimes life's greatest challenges could lead to its greatest opportunities. 3 months after the initial incident, Windsor Castle had become a very different place. The ancient stones remained unchanged, but the spirit within them had transformed. On this particular morning, Oliver wheeled through the newly installed accessibility features, leading a group of visiting families, each with children facing different mobility challenges. "See this lift here?" Oliver explained, pointing to an elegantly designed mechanism that blended seamlessly with the castle's historic architecture. "We designed it to look like it's always been part of the castle. James Sullivan wrote about this in his journal, how accessibility features shouldn't stand out, but should feel natural, like they belong." Among the group was Lucy Chen, Marcus's 8-year-old daughter, who walked with leg braces. Her father stood behind her, a changed man from the impatient tourist who had once caused such trouble. Now he watched with quiet pride as his daughter engaged with the tour, asking thoughtful questions about the castle's modifications. Sergeant Sullivan, though still maintaining his post, had become a familiar sight to all the children who visited. They knew his story now, about his brother James, about his actions that day with Oliver, and about his ongoing support for the accessibility initiative. Some of the children had taken to saluting him as they passed, which he acknowledged with the slightest tilt of his head, barely noticeable to anyone who wasn't looking for it. "The best part," Oliver continued, wheeling backward with practiced ease to face his group, "is that these changes don't just help people with mobility issues. Watch this." He pressed a button, and a hidden panel in the wall opened to reveal an interactive touchscreen display. Now everyone can explore parts of the castle that might be physically challenging to reach. Dr. Helen Sullivan, who had become a regular presence at the castle, wheeled up beside Oliver. "Would you like to show them the special feature, Oliver?" she asked, her eyes twinkling with pride. Oliver grinned and tapped the screen a few times. Suddenly, James Sullivan's voice filled the air, reading from his journal entries about the castle's history and architecture. The children fell silent, listening to the passionate words of someone who had dreamed of this very moment, but never lived to see it. "That's my son's voice," Dr. Sullivan explained to the group, her eyes glistening. "He never got to visit Windsor Castle in person, but now he's helping guide others through it every day." Sarah, watching from nearby, couldn't help but marvel at how far they'd come. Her son, once self-conscious about his disability, was now leading tours and inspiring others. The castle staff had even created a special position for him, Junior Accessibility Ambassador, complete with an official badge that he wore proudly on his jacket. Lady Margaret appeared, clipboard in hand, ready for the day's Accessibility Committee meeting. "Oliver," she called, "shall we show them the new project?" The group followed them to a previously unused chamber that had been transformed into an innovative perspective room. Here, visitors could experience the castle from different heights and angles through clever use of mirrors, platforms, and digital displays. Children in wheelchairs could see views traditionally only available to standing visitors, while able-bodied visitors could better understand the challenges and unique perspectives of those with mobility issues. "This was actually Lucy's idea," Oliver announced, making the young girl blush with pride. "She asked what it would be like to see the castle from different heights, and it got us thinking." Marcus stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on his daughter's shoulder. "Lucy has taught me more about seeing things differently than anyone," he admitted, the humility in his voice a far cry from his former arrogance. Captain Blackwood joined the group, his presence adding official weight to the tour. "What you're seeing today," he addressed the families, "is just the beginning. Thanks to our young ambassador and his team, These innovations are being implemented at historic sites across Britain. The tour continued through the castle, each stop revealing new ways that historical preservation and accessibility had been harmoniously combined. Oliver had worked closely with the architects and historians to ensure that every modification respected the castle's heritage while making it more inclusive. Near the end of the tour, they passed a new installation that had become one of the castle's most popular features, a wall of photographs showing visitors with various disabilities enjoying the castle. At the center was the viral photo of Sergeant Sullivan breaking protocol to help Oliver. But now it was surrounded by hundreds of other moments of inclusion and acceptance. "You know what the best part is?" Oliver asked his group as they gathered in the courtyard. "Every person who visits now helps us make it even better. We learn from everyone's experience." Dr. Sullivan wheeled up to him, holding out a familiar leather-bound journal. "James would add new ideas to his journal every day," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. He believed that making places accessible wasn't a one-time thing. It was an ongoing journey of learning and improving. As if on cue, a young girl in the group raised her hand. "I noticed something," she said shyly. "The buttons for the lift. They're a bit too high for someone my size in a wheelchair." Instead of dismissing her observation, Oliver immediately pulled out his tablet to make notes. "This is exactly what we need," he explained. "Real feedback from real people. Would you like to join our junior advisory committee?" The girl's face lit up with surprise and joy, much like Oliver's had done that first day when Lady Margaret had offered him a role at the castle. The cycle of inclusion and empowerment was continuing, growing stronger with each new voice added to the chorus. As the tour concluded, Sarah overheard one parent say to another, "You know, we almost didn't come. We thought historic places like this wouldn't be for us." She watched as their child, using a walker, navigated the newly modified pathways with confidence. But now, Oliver finished overhearing them. "The castle belongs to everyone, just like James always said it should." 6 months after the incident that changed everything, Windsor Castle faced its biggest challenge yet. A prominent architectural preservation society had publicly criticized the accessibility modifications, claiming they compromised the site's historical integrity. The story had made national headlines, threatening to undermine everything Oliver and the team had worked to achieve. The castle's conference room was tense as the accessibility committee gathered for an emergency meeting. Oliver sat between his mother and Dr. Sullivan, his fingers nervously drumming on James's journal. The newspaper headlines seemed to mock them from the conference table. "Historic preservation versus modern accessibility. Has Windsor Castle gone too far?" "They're saying we've ruined the castle's authenticity," Lady Margaret reported, her usual composure strained. "The Architectural Heritage Foundation is demanding a review of all our modifications." Marcus Chen, who had become one of their strongest advocates, leaned forward. "Their main argument is that these changes diminish the historical experience for regular visitors." His voice caught on the word regular, his gaze drifting to his daughter Lucy, who sat beside him, her leg braces recently decorated with castle-inspired designs. Captain Blackwood stood at the window, his military bearing more rigid than usual. "They're sending a delegation tomorrow. The press will be here too." He turned to face the room. "They want to speak with the person responsible for these changes." All eyes turned to Oliver. Sarah reached for her son's hand, but before she could speak, Oliver straightened in his wheelchair. "Then I'll speak with them," he said, his voice steady despite his obvious nervousness. Sergeant Sullivan, who had been given special permission to attend this meeting, stepped forward from his position by the door. "Oliver, you don't have to do this alone. We can handle the delegation." "No," Oliver replied, opening James's journal to a marked page. "James wrote something here that I think matters now more than ever." He cleared his throat and read, "The true test of progress isn't in making changes. It's in defending them when they're challenged." Dr. Sullivan wiped away a tear as she heard her son's words. James faced similar criticism during his university research, she shared. People told him he was trying to change too much, too fast. The next morning dawned cold and clear. The delegation from the Architectural Heritage Foundation arrived precisely on time. 3 stern-looking individuals in expensive suits, accompanied by a small army of reporters and photographers. Oliver waited for them in the courtyard, positioned exactly where his life had changed 6 months ago. "This is the boy?" one of the delegates asked, peering down at Oliver through wire-rimmed glasses. "The one responsible for all these modifications?" Oliver met the man's gaze steadily. "Would you like a tour?" he offered, gesturing to the castle behind him. "I'd like to show you something before we talk." The delegates exchanged skeptical looks but agreed. Oliver led them through the castle, but not along the usual tour route. Instead, he took them to the before and after gallery they had created, where photographs showed the castle's evolution over centuries. "The castle has always changed," Oliver explained, pointing to various images. "Every generation added something new: Victorian plumbing, electric lights, central heating. But look closely at how they did it." He wheeled to a particular photograph. "See how each change respected what came before while making the castle better for everyone." The delegates shifted uncomfortably as Oliver continued his presentation. He showed them the hidden lift mechanisms, designed to blend seamlessly with ancient stonework. He demonstrated how the digital displays could be concealed behind panels that matched the castle's original wood. "And this," Oliver said, leading them to a particular wall, "is why we do it." The wall displayed hundreds of letters and photographs from visitors who had never been able to fully experience a castle before. Children in wheelchairs beaming in front of towers they could finally access. Elderly visitors using new ramps that looked like they'd been there for centuries. Families sharing experiences they never thought possible. "But the historical integrity," one delegate began, "is about more than just stones and mortar," Oliver interrupted, his voice gaining strength. "It's about the stories these places tell. And for too long, those stories left out people like me, like James Sullivan, like so many others who deserve to be part of history too." He pulled out his tablet and pulled up a specially prepared presentation. "These are my original drawings, showing how we preserved every historical detail while making the castle accessible. And these," he swiped to a new set of images, "are the visitor numbers since we made the changes. They've doubled. People aren't just visiting. They're engaging with history in ways they never could before." The delegates huddled together, whispering among themselves. The photographers' cameras clicked rapidly, capturing every moment. Finally, the lead delegate stepped forward. "Young man," he said, his tone notably softer, "you've given us much to think about. Your attention to historical detail while implementing these changes is impressive." As if to emphasize his point, a group of schoolchildren passed by, one girl in a wheelchair seamlessly using one of the new lifts. She waved at Oliver as she passed, clearly a regular visitor. "Perhaps," the delegate continued, "we need to update our own understanding of historical preservation. After all, history isn't just about preserving the past, it's about ensuring it remains alive and accessible for future generations." The press conference that followed was not what anyone had expected. Instead of criticism, the Architectural Heritage Foundation announced a new partnership with Windsor Castle's Accessibility Initiative. They would help document and share the castle's innovative solutions with other historic sites around the world. As the delegates and press departed, Oliver sat in the courtyard with Dr. Sullivan and Sergeant Sullivan, James's journal open on his lap. "Do you think we did the right thing?" he asked them. Dr. Sullivan smiled, reaching for her son's hand. "James always said that the right thing isn't always the easy thing. But look around. You've helped make his dream come true." Sergeant Sullivan, preparing to return to his post, paused. "You know, Oliver, when I broke protocol that day to help you, I thought I was just doing what needed to be done. But sometimes that's exactly how the biggest changes start, with one person doing what needs to be done." Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.